The sun was low when the human man, Ethan Cole, reached the edge of the ruined fortress. The air smelled of rust, dust, and something wild. He had heard rumors about this place, stories whispered in fear by alien traders. They called it the Cage of Beasts, a place where monsters once roared behind iron bars. Ethan thought it was just old talk to scare travelers, until he heard the screams. They weren't human screams, but they were full of rage and pain. He moved slowly, hand on his pulse rifle, his boots crunching over broken stone. As he turned the corner, he froze. There it was, a huge steel cage in the middle of an old stone courtyard. Inside were two alien females, tall and strong, their bodies marked with scars. They were fighting like wild animals, clawing, kicking, slamming into each other. No words, no rules. Just brutal force and growls that shook his chest. One had red skin like burnt copper, with glowing eyes that flared in the dark. The other had pale blue skin, her silver hair matted and stained with dirt. Both were fierce, but not evil, not mindless. They didn't notice him at first, too busy trying to overpower each other. Then, in a brief pause, the red-skinned one looked up. Her eyes met his, and for a second, Ethan forgot to breathe. It wasn't hate he saw, or hunger. It was something else: fear, hope, and a silent question. Will you help us? Ethan lowered his weapon slowly, stepping closer. The cage was locked with a thick rusted bolt. He saw broken chains on their wrists, and collars around their necks. They weren't just fighters, they were prisoners. An old alien man from the nearby village appeared behind him. Don't free them, the man warned, voice shaking. They were put there for a reason. Ethan asked why, but the old man only muttered, "They're cursed, they're dangerous, they'll turn on you." But Ethan didn't see monsters. He saw two broken souls thrown into a pit to survive like animals. He couldn't walk away, not after seeing their eyes. He studied the lock again, then pulled out a small plasma cutter. The blue-skinned one watched him, blood dripping from her arm, but she didn't move to stop him. When the bolt snapped, the door creaked open slowly. For a moment, no one moved, not even the wind. Then both females stepped forward, not toward each other, but toward him. Ethan raised his hands carefully. "Easy," he said, though they didn't understand his words. The red one sniffed the air near his neck. The blue one touched his hand. Softly, they weren't attacking. They were curious. It was like they hadn't seen a kind face in years, maybe ever. Ethan took a step back, but they followed, moving like shadows stuck to his feet. He looked back at the old man, who had already turned and walked away, shaking his head. Ethan knew what he had done could cost him, but he couldn't regret it. Not after what he saw in their eyes. The two aliens stayed close to him as he left the ruins, never looking back at their cage. They didn't speak, didn't ask questions, but their eyes never left him. They followed him down the dusty path like he was their only light in the darkness. As night came, Ethan made camp near a small cliff. He gave them water, which they drank quickly, and some dried food, which they ate slowly. They sat near him, one on each side, their bodies relaxed but their eyes alert. He asked them simple questions, but they only tilted their heads, still. They stayed close, too close, like they were guarding something precious, or maybe like he was the precious one now. Before sleeping, Ethan looked up at the stars. He came here looking for old tech and lost ruins. Instead, he found two warriors locked in a cage like beasts, and now they were free. But something told him this was not the end. This was just the beginning of something wild, dangerous, and maybe even beautiful. Because when he freed them, they stopped fighting each other. But they didn't stop watching him, and deep inside, Ethan had a strange feeling that they were no longer fighting to escape. They were going to start fighting for him. The morning light touched the leaves as Ethan opened his eyes. He was surprised to see both alien girls already awake, sitting silently near the campfire. One was sharpening a broken piece of metal into a blade. The other was carefully placing stones in a circle like it meant something important. They didn't speak, not to him, not to each other, But the moment his eyes opened, both turned their heads and stared at him. He could feel it again, that strange tension, heavy in the air, like something was growing between them and him, but he didn't know what. Ethan stood and stretched, trying to act normal. The red-skinned one walked closer and placed a bundle of wild berries in his hand. He looked at them, then at her, and nodded with a small smile. She didn't smile back. But she didn't move away either. The blue-skinned one narrowed her eyes and stood up too. Stepping between them, Ethan raised both hands and laughed nervously, but inside, he felt something sharp twist in his chest. This wasn't simple kindness anymore. There was a fire in their eyes, but it wasn't rage. It was something stronger, something dangerous. He decided to move on, hoping walking would cool things down. They followed him closely, always on either side. When they passed near a stream, he knelt to wash his face. Suddenly, the blue-skinned one leapt forward, grabbing something from the bushes. A thin snake with glassy fangs thrashed in her grip. She crushed it with one hand and looked back at him. Ethan realized it had been aiming for him, hiding in the grass. She had saved him without hesitation, and the red-skinned one didn't like that. Later, as they climbed a rocky hill, Ethan's boot slipped and he stumbled. The red-skinned girl was faster. She caught him before he fell, pulling him up with strength that shocked him. Their faces were close for a moment, and Ethan felt her breath on his cheek. Then the blue-skinned one shoved her shoulder hard, separating them like a jealous child. Ethan backed away quickly, but both girls now stood facing each other, bodies tense, muscles ready. He shouted, waved his hands, trying to calm them down. They didn't understand his words, but they seemed to hear his heart. After a long pause, they both turned away, stepping back but never breaking eye contact. That night, the silence was heavier than the cold. Ethan sat between them again, but now they were both closer than before. The red-skinned girl placed her hand on his chest, feeling the beat of his heart. She tilted her head, confused, curious. Then the blue-skinned one grabbed his hand and placed it over her own chest. Ethan's heart raced, not from fear, but from something he didn't want to name. He wasn't sure if he was imagining it, but it felt like they were both claiming him in their own way. Not just as a protector, not just as the one who freed them, but as something more. When he lay down to sleep, both girls lay beside him, not touching him, not speaking, but facing inward like two guards watching over their treasure. He tried to ignore it, tried to sleep. But every time he opened his eyes, one of them was looking at him. And when he finally drifted off, he had strange dreams, dreams of heat, fire, and hands pulling him in two directions. The next morning, something changed. They were not fighting anymore, not with fists or blades, but every step, every look, every move they made was a silent challenge. Each girl tried to walk closer to him than the other, tried to carry more weight, hunt faster, smile brighter. They didn't speak his language, but Ethan was starting to understand theirs. It wasn't war anymore. It was competition, and he was the prize. He had set them free to stop the fighting. But now, the fight had only changed shape, and as they reached the edge of the next valley, Ethan finally said the words aloud, "I think they both want me." Neither of them answered, but both of them turned and looked at him at the same time, not like prisoners, not like wild beasts, but like two hearts that had found the same desire. And deep inside, Ethan knew this strange journey had only just begun, because whatever they were before, whatever they had become, now they were his, and they weren't going to let go easily. The next village was not far, hidden behind hills and tall trees with silver leaves. Ethan had hoped for rest, maybe supplies, maybe answers. But the moment he arrived with the two alien women walking beside him, the village froze. Doors shut. Children hid, and eyes watched from behind curtains of woven light. He raised his hands and spoke gently, trying to explain he meant no harm. But they didn't look at him. They looked at the two females behind him like they were cursed spirits. A tall elder with pale horns finally stepped out, staff in hand, voice sharp as a blade. "Why do you walk with the bonded beasts?" the elder said. Ethan blinked. confused. What bonded beasts? The elder tapped his staff to the ground. You set them free, didn't you? Ethan nodded slowly. They were caged, starving. They were fighting, the elder interrupted. Yes, they always fight. He looked at Ethan with pity. Now they will fight over you, Ethan. Didn't answer, but deep down, he knew the elder was right. He had seen it in their eyes, in the way they moved. The way they watched him. He was no longer just the man who saved them. He had become something else, something dangerous, a reason to fight again. That night, the villagers offered him a place to stay, but refused to let the two women enter. Ethan tried to argue, but the girls didn't protest. They stood outside his door. Like statues, like guards, he couldn't sleep. Not while they stood in the cold, not while tension wrapped around his chest like chains. So he opened the door and stepped out, finding them sitting under the stars. They didn't speak, but when he sat between them, they each reached for his hand, not like a prisoner, not like a leader, like someone they both didn't want to lose. A sudden wind rose, carrying strange sounds from the trees. Ethan turned, eyes narrowing, as a soft rustling turned into stomping. 3 alien warriors with armor and glowing spears stepped from the shadows. Their leader pointed at Ethan. You've drawn the beasts into our village. The red-skinned female stepped in front of him without thinking. The blue-skinned one growled low, and ready beside her, Ethan shouted, Stop, I'll leave with them. We'll go now. But it was too late. The warriors charged, and the 2 females moved like lightning, no longer fighting each other. They fought together, one struck low, the other high, like they had trained their whole lives as one. Ethan ducked behind a stone as spears clashed and sparks lit the air. When the dust cleared, 2 warriors lay broken, and the last one crawled away. The girls turned to Ethan, not proud, not smiling, just waiting for his reaction. He looked at them, heart pounding. You protected me. They didn't understand the words, but they understood his voice. And both stepped forward again, closer than before. The village was silent after that. No one dared speak to him, but no one stopped him either. They walked out before sunrise, heading toward the wildlands beyond the hills. The air was cooler, but Ethan felt heat building in every step. The girls no longer walked behind him or beside him. They walked close, too close, each one trying to stay at his side. Their shoulders brushed his arms. Their hands almost touched. Ethan didn't know what to say, didn't know what to feel. He had seen love before, but this was something ancient and raw, like they were made to fight for one bond. One male, one life. That night, the girls sat across from each other, silent, staring. Then the blue-skinned one spoke for the first time, one word, mate. The red-skinned one growled, low and dangerous, and replied with the same word. Mate. Ethan froze, his heart skipping, his breath caught between fear and wonder. He realized they had not just chosen him, they had declared it. To him, to each other, to the stars above. They were no longer just bonded to him. They were rivals now, in a way that could not be ignored. He stood, trying to speak, trying to calm them. But his voice felt small, useless, like a leaf in a storm. The girls stood too, eyes locked, breathing heavy. Then they turned to him, and he saw something that made his heart break a little. Neither of them wanted to hurt the other, but both of them were willing to fight. For him, Ethan stepped back. Unsure, scared of what came next, because the war he thought he had stopped had only just begun. The sky turned red as the sun dipped behind the cliffs. Ethan sat by the fire, staring at the flames. His thoughts were loud, louder than the crackling wood or the distant howls. He couldn't shake the feeling that something big was coming, not a storm, not a beast, but a decision, a choice he never wanted to make. The 2 alien girls sat apart that night. Not beside him like before. They were watching each other, not speaking, not moving, but their silence felt louder than war drums. Ethan had traveled worlds, faced danger, seen battles, but now, sitting between 2 hearts that burned for him, He felt completely powerless. At dawn, they began walking again. The path led them to an open field where stone pillars stood like bones of an old god. And waiting near the center was a group of aliens dressed in bone armor and war paint. Ethan stopped, eyes narrowing, hand near his weapon. But the two girls didn't flinch. They stepped forward calmly, as if they knew what this place was. An old alien woman stepped from the crowd, leaning on a twisted cane. Her eyes were blind. But her voice was sharp like a knife. "You bring the bonded," she said without facing Ethan. "They have declared a mate, and the law must be followed." Ethan looked at the girls, confused. What law? The elder raised her cane and pointed to the stone circle. "Only one may stand beside you, human, and they both must prove who it will be." Ethan stepped forward quickly. "No, I don't want them to fight. I didn't ask for this." But the red-skinned girl looked at him with fire in her eyes. The blue-skinned one touched his hand softly, then turned away. They had made up their minds, not for hate, not for pride, but for love. And they would fight, not as enemies, but as two hearts burning for one bond. The crowd formed a circle. Whispering in their strange tongue, Ethan stood, helpless in the center, heart pounding. The two girls walked into the stone ring, facing each other. They didn't wear armor, didn't carry blades, just their hands, their eyes, and years of pain hidden in their hearts. The red-skinned girl struck first. A quick blow meant to test, not harm. The blue-skinned one dodged and answered with a sweeping kick. They moved like lightning, fast and deadly, but something was different. They weren't fighting to kill. They were fighting to be understood, to prove who felt more, who would give more, who deserved more. Ethan shouted, begged them to stop, but his words fell like feathers on stone. Every strike they traded told a story of hunger, of cages, of a freedom that was not enough without love, of pain buried under years of silence, and of a single moment when he opened the cage that changed everything. Blood stained the dust. And both girls slowed, breathing hard. Their bodies trembled, not from fear, but from everything they couldn't say. The red-skinned girl looked at Ethan, her lip bleeding, her eyes soft. Then the blue-skinned one stumbled back, falling to her knees. But instead of rising again, she looked up at her rival and whispered a word. Ethan didn't understand it, but the red-skinned girl did. She dropped to her knees too, and for the first time they bowed to each other, not as enemies, but as sisters who had shared too much pain to hate. The crowd gasped. The elder slammed her cane down. "This is not the law," she cried. "There must be one." But Ethan stepped forward, voice strong. "Then your law is broken." He helped both girls to their feet, holding their hands. "I didn't free them to watch them bleed," he said. "They are not beasts anymore. They are people." The elder looked at the crowd, but no one moved, no one spoke. Then someone clapped slow, quiet but real, and more followed, until the field was filled with the sound of hands, not weapons. The old rules had cracked, and through that crack, something new had begun to grow. That night, the fire burned quietly. The two girls sat beside Ethan again, not to fight, but to rest. They leaned on him, heads against his shoulders, hearts beating slower now. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time, he felt peace, not because the battle was over, but because love had chosen a different way, and maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. The days after the challenge were quiet, but not peaceful. Whispers followed them wherever they walked. Aliens watched with wide eyes, some full of fear, others full of confusion. No one had seen two rivals bow instead of destroy. No one had seen a human take both hands and walk away with them. Ethan felt the weight of every stare, every voice behind his back. He had broken something, an old rule, a sacred law, but he couldn't feel regret. Not when the two girls now walked beside him without anger in their eyes. They still glanced at each other, still moved carefully, but there was something softer now, like a wall had broken between them, and in its place, a bridge was quietly growing. They traveled deeper into the forest lands. past places where even maps ended. There, among giant roots and glowing plants, Ethan built a shelter from broken steel and soft branches. It wasn't much, but it was home. The girls helped him, sometimes working side by side, sometimes sneaking. Glances when they thought the other wasn't looking. At night, they sat by the fire, not touching him, but sitting close enough to feel his warmth. And when he spoke, even if they didn't understand every word, they listened like his voice was the only sound they trusted. One evening, the red-skinned girl brought him wild fruit. Sweet and sticky, she sat beside him, eyes bright in the firelight, her hand brushing his by accident, or maybe not. Ethan smiled, thanking her, and she smiled back, a rare thing that lit her whole face. But the blue-skinned girl stood nearby, watching with eyes that hid too much. She turned and walked into the trees without a word. Ethan followed her after a while. Finding her near the stream, she was staring at her reflection in the water, like it was someone else. When she saw him, she didn't move, just whispered one word, "Not enough." He stepped closer, confused. "What do you mean?" She pointed to herself, then to the forest, then to the fire behind them. "Not enough," she said again, softer. Ethan touched her shoulder gently, and she closed her eyes like his hand was a memory she didn't want to lose. The next morning, she was gone. No footprints, no sound, just her empty sleeping mat and the cold space beside it. The red-skinned girl woke up and knew immediately. She sniffed the air, growled low, and started packing supplies. Ethan stopped her. "What are you doing?" She looked at him and tapped her chest, then pointed to the trees. She was going to find her, with or without his help. They searched all day, calling out even if they knew she wouldn't answer. The forest grew darker, the air heavier. Then Ethan heard it, a cry, sharp and distant. They ran toward it, climbing rocks and slipping over roots until they found her. She had fallen into a deep trench, her leg twisted, blood on her face. She looked up at them with tears that made no sound, just shaking breath and broken pride. The red-skinned girl didn't hesitate. She climbed down, lifted the blue-skinned one on her back, and climbed up again with strength fueled by more than muscle. When they reached the top, she laid her down gently, and for the first time, pressed her forehead to hers. No words, no fight, just breath and closeness. Ethan stood frozen, heart thudding. Something had changed, not just between him and them, but between the two girls who had once tried to tear each other apart. That night, he built a new fire, a bigger one. He sat between them again. Not as a judge, not as a prize, but as something they both loved and maybe even shared. He held one hand in his left, the other in his right. Neither pulled away, and for the first time, all three of them fell asleep together under the same stars. Not as strangers, not as a human and two beasts, but as something new, something strange and fragile and full of hope. The wind carried news faster than any voice. By the time the sun had crossed the next hill, whispers had already reached the outer villages. A human had bonded with not one, but two, the cage fighters, the wild ones, the ones who were never meant to love. Now they walked beside him, slept beside him, and called him theirs without using a single word. Ethan didn't care much for what others said. His little home in the forest had become a place of peace, of healing. He spent his days teaching them words, simple ones like sky, food, safe. They listened carefully, repeating softly, their voices new and unsure. Sometimes they laughed when they said the wrong thing, and that sound felt like music in the trees. But peace never stays for long. One afternoon, a shadow passed over the trees, a transport ship landing where ships shouldn't go. Ethan stood with narrowed eyes as armored soldiers stepped out, their uniforms marked with Earth's official seal. The lead officer's voice was sharp, almost angry. "We've been tracking your signal." Ethan raised his hands calmly. "I didn't call for rescue." The officer looked past him and froze when he saw the two alien women stepping out from the trees. Both stood tall, bare feet on the mossy ground, eyes steady, unafraid. "You're in danger," the officer said. "You've been bonded to." Unstable species. Ethan shook his head. They saved my life more than once. They're still classified as hostile, the officer replied, his voice colder now. They need to be separated, studied, controlled. The red-skinned girl growled low. The blue-skinned one stepped closer to Ethan. Ethan's voice turned to steel. No one's taking them. The officer signaled and weapons were raised. The moment metal clicked, the two girls stepped in front of Ethan like shields made of fury and loyalty. Ethan stood behind them, heart racing, but something inside him had already made its choice. These weren't just survivors or strange companions. They were his family, his heart, his bond, and no command, no soldier, no rulebook was going to break that. Then something unexpected happened. The red-skinned girl stepped forward slowly. Palms open, she knelt on the grass and looked up at the officer. The blue-skinned one followed, doing the same, not in fear, but in peace. A strange silence filled the forest, and even the birds stopped singing. They're not beasts, Ethan said again, voice low but powerful. They're choosing not to fight. The officer looked around, uneasy. What was this if not control, if not dominance? But something deeper, something almost sacred. Finally, the officer gave the order. Stand down. The weapons lowered, the tension fell. But Ethan knew the danger hadn't passed. The soldiers left without saying another word. But their eyes had memorized too much. That night, Ethan didn't sleep. He sat between the two girls again, watching the stars, listening to their slow breathing. He felt their hands find his again, like they always did. But there was a new silence now, not from fear, but from understanding. They knew others would come, with bigger guns and colder. Laws still, they didn't let go, and neither did he. The next morning, the girls began painting marks on the trees around their home, strange symbols, lines that glowed faintly at night. He didn't know what they meant, but he knew they were making a boundary, a promise, a warning, a line no stranger should cross. Ethan helped them, not with paint, but by strengthening the walls of their shelter, adding light traps, early alerts, water systems, and defense gear. If someone came next time, he would be ready, not just for a fight, but to protect a bond the galaxy didn't understand. Because something had happened in that moment when the soldiers came, something deeper than words. The girls had knelt not in surrender, but in defiance of violence, in respect for love. And Ethan had felt something move inside him, like his heart had changed shape, like he was no longer just human, he was theirs, and they were his, no matter what came next. The sun rose slower than usual that day. It was the kind of morning where the sky glowed soft orange, and even the wind held its breath. Ethan stood at the edge of the forest, his boots sinking slightly into the wet grass. Behind him, the two alien girls were silent, their eyes scanning the horizon. They felt it too, something shifting in the air, like the universe itself was holding back a secret. They had been preparing for days, not because they were afraid, but because they knew. The galaxy never lets peace live quietly. The moment they broke the laws of love, they became something the world didn't have a name for. Not a couple, not a match, something more dangerous, more powerful, something free. When the first hovercraft appeared in the sky, Ethan didn't flinch. It was bigger than before, painted with symbols of high authority, not soldiers this time, but leaders, watchers, judges, the ones who made the rules and never questioned them. They landed without dust, without noise, but with sharp eyes and silent mouths. One step forward, robes flowing, face hidden behind a silver mask. The human who broke the bond code, the figure said slowly. Ethan didn't reply, not yet. He waited as the two girls stepped beside him, tall, calm, unshaken. The figure pointed at them. You took two when one was law. Ethan nodded. I didn't take them. They chose me. The figure's voice sharpened. And now you force us to choose for you. Ethan stepped forward, just one step, but it echoed louder than a shout. No one chooses for us, he said, voice steady. We made a new kind of bond. The silence that followed was long and heavy. Behind the masks, the officials whispered, argued, tried to understand what they were seeing. But what stood before them wasn't a mistake. It was truth, alive and breathing, a human, once alone, now protected by two hearts that had once hated each other, a red flame and a blue tide, both burning. For the same reason, not control, not power, but love that refused to fit inside the lines they had drawn long ago. Finally, the lead judge spoke again, voice lower now. There is no law for this. Ethan smiled faintly. Then it's time to write a new one. The judge didn't answer, but turned and walked back to the ship. One by one, the others followed, leaving behind silence. But no threats, no cages, no chains, as the ship vanished. Into the sky, the girls turned to Ethan. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their hands found his again, fingers locking like pieces that had always belonged together. He looked at them and saw everything that had changed, from the blood in the cage to the peace in their eyes now. He had seen war, seen pain, but this was the fight that mattered most. The fight to love without permission. The months that followed were quiet, but full. The forest grew around them, wrapping their home in green safety. The red-skinned girl carved art into the trees, telling the story of how they met. The blue-skinned one built towers of stone beside the river, placing a single flower at the top each morning. And Ethan, he grew stronger, not in body, but in soul, because being loved by two who were once called beasts had made him something more than human. One evening, a child from a nearby village wandered into their clearing. She stared wide-eyed at the three of them sitting by the fire. She pointed at the girls and whispered, "Are they monsters?" Ethan smiled, shaking his head. "No," he said softly. "They're my family, and that was how it began, not with battles or speeches, but with quiet moments, shared warmth, and hands that didn't let go." The forest, once silent, now echoed with laughter. Not just from them, but from others who came, watched, and learned that love could take many shapes. And sometimes the most powerful bond begins when you open a cage and set the monsters free, only to find they were never monsters at all. They were just waiting for someone to see them, to choose them, to love them,